The ticking of the Patek Philippe on Yi Min Kwan's wrist was the only sound inside the cabin of the black sedan, a rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat that felt increasingly like a countdown. Yi Min was a man of absolute, surgical precision, a strategist whose life was built on the unwavering reliability of schedules and the cold logic of the Korean underworld. In the syndicate, time was more than a measurement. It was a form of respect, and a minute's delay could mean the difference between a successful shipment and a federal raid. But tonight, the clock had betrayed him. He sat in the usual place, a shadow-drenched corner of a cafe on the edge of Baltimore's industrial district, where the scent of burnt coffee beans fought the salty tang of the harbor. For 3 years, this had been their sanctuary, the only place where Yi Min wasn't a boss, and Zariah Cole wasn't just a waitress in worn shoes. Zariah was his anchor, a woman whose skin was the color of deep mahogany and whose strength was quieter, yet more resilient than any soldier in his employ. She was 20 minutes late, then 40. Yi Min adjusted his silk tie, his sharp jawline tightening. He had begged her to quit that diner, to let him wrap her in the safety of his wealth and the steel of his protection. But Zariah, who had been working since she was a child to carry her family's burdens, refused to be a bird in a cage. She wanted her own life, her own paycheck, and her own dignity. Yi Min had respected that, but tonight, that respect felt like a noose. He checked his phone, silence. Then, unable to endure the stillness any longer, he signaled his driver. As the sedan moved toward the restaurant where Zariah worked, Yi Min saw the flashing blue and red lights reflecting off the wet asphalt. A crowd had gathered near a dark alleyway, their faces pale under the street lamps. He stepped out of the car, his tailored wool coat catching the mist. He didn't need to ask. There, scattered across the damp pavement like broken glass, were the remnants of her shift. A notepad, a stray pen, and the unmistakable, jarring white of a waitress's apron. But it wasn't white anymore. It was stained with a spreading, violent crimson, a red that screamed of a mistake Yi Min knew he would have to settle in blood. The 4-inch gap between his secret life and her innocent one had finally closed, and the world was about to learn that you don't touch what belongs to the king of the North Side. Make sure to subscribe, like, comment, and share. The rain in Baltimore didn't wash things away, it only made them cling. It made the smell of old iron and exhaust stick to the back of the throat, and it made the silence in the back of the sedan feel heavy, like a physical weight pressing against Yi Min's chest. He stared out the window, his reflection in the glass showing a man of stone, but his hands, hidden in the pockets of his overcoat, were tight enough to snap bone. "Drive faster," he said. His voice was a low, dangerous rasp that made the driver's shoulders hitch. They traced the path Zariah took every night, a predictable, hardworking route that Yi Min had mapped out 1,000 times in his head. From the diner on 4th, past the closed-up laundromat, and toward the bus stop that sat under a flickering sodium lamp. As the car rounded the corner, the world turned a nauseating shade of emergency blue. Yi Min didn't wait for the car to fully stop. He stepped out into the mist, the soles of his polished shoes clicking against the uneven cobblestones. He didn't look like a man in mourning. He looked like a predator assessing a kill site. A small crowd of strangers had gathered behind a line of yellow tape, their faces illuminated by the rhythmic pulse of a police cruiser. They were whispering, clutching their jackets, looking at the ground with that morbid, distant curiosity of those who had witnessed a tragedy that wasn't theirs. He pushed through them. A young patrol officer started to move toward him, hand on his belt, ready to bark a command about staying back, but he stopped mid-stride. There was something in Yi Min's eyes, a cold, vacuum-like void, that signaled he wasn't a man who followed tape. Yi Min's gaze dropped to the sidewalk. The streetlights caught the wetness of the ground, turning the puddles into mirrors of oil and light. And there, near a discarded carry-out container, was the white apron. It was crumpled, looking small and fragile against the grid of the city. The fabric was heavy with water and something much darker. The blood didn't look like it did in the movies. It looked like spilled ink, thick and stubborn, refusing to be diluted by the drizzle. A few feet away, her cracked phone lay face up. The screen was shattered into a spiderweb of glass, but a notification was still glowing through the cracks. It was a text from him, sent 40 minutes ago. "I'm at the booth. Don't be late." The irony tasted like copper. He knelt, ignoring the dampness seeping into his expensive trousers. He reached out, his long, steady fingers hovering just an inch above the stained apron. He could almost smell her, the faint, lingering scent of cocoa butter and the cheap, industrial soap from the restaurant kitchen. "They took her to St. Jude," a voice said. It was a bystander, an older man with a tattered umbrella who looked like he'd seen too much of this city's darkness. She didn't say a word, just held her side and looked at the sky like she was waiting for someone. Yimin stood up slowly. The vulnerability he had felt in the cafe was gone, replaced by a terrifying, crystalline clarity. He looked at the shadows of the alleyway, then back at the blood on the stones. This wasn't just a crime. It was an accounting error in a world he was supposed to rule. As he turned back toward the sedan, the too calm mask was firmly back in place, but the air around him seemed to turn several degrees colder. The search was over. The war had begun. The sliding glass doors of St. Jude's emergency department hissed open, exhaling the sharp, sterile scent of rubbing alcohol and industrial floor wax. Yimin stepped into the fluorescent glare, his presence an immediate friction against the chaotic hum of the waiting room. To his left, a man clutched a bloody towel to his hand. To his right, a child coughed rhythmically against a mother's shoulder. In his world, Yimin was the sun. Everything orbited his silence. But here, under the flickering lights of a public crisis, he was just another man in an expensive suit standing in the way of the overworked. He approached the high plastic partition of the triage desk. Behind it, a nurse with tired eyes and a name tag that read B. Higgins didn't even look up from her monitor. She was typing with a frantic, mechanical speed, her stethoscope draped like a silver noose around her neck. "I'm looking for Zariah Cole," Yimin said. His voice was a low, controlled vibration, the kind that usually made lieutenants drop their gaze. The nurse didn't flinch. She hit the enter key with a definitive snap before finally glancing up. She saw the slicked-back hair, the sharp, clean cut of his jaw, and the tailored wool of his coat, a garment that likely cost more than her annual mortgage. To her, he wasn't a man of power. He was a complication. He was a distraction from the sirens currently wailing in the bay. "Are you family?" she asked, her voice flat, drained of anything resembling warmth. The question hit Yimin with the force of a physical blow. In the shadows of their private life, he was her protector, her fiancé, the man who spent his nights tracing the lines of her palms. But on a legal clipboard in a city that didn't know his name, he was a ghost. "I'm her fiancé," he replied, the word feeling heavy and unauthorized on his tongue. The nurse sighed, a sound of pure exhaustion. "Fiancé isn't immediate family, sir. Policy is strict, especially tonight. We have a gunshot victim in surgery and 3 multi-car pileups coming in. If you aren't a spouse, a parent, or a sibling, you stay in the waiting room." "She has no other family in this city," Yimin countered, his eyes darkening, the calm beginning to fray at the edges into something much more predatory. "I am the only one she has." "Then you can be the only one waiting in those plastic chairs," she said, pointing a ballpoint pen toward the rows of bolted-down seating. "I can't give you status updates, and I can't let you back there. You're just a stranger at my desk, honey. Sit down, or I'll have security move you." Yimin's hand tightened on the edge of the counter. For a split second, the urge to reach through that glass and show her exactly how much of a stranger he wasn't flared in his gut. He could have a dozen men here in 10 minutes. He could buy this wing of the hospital by morning. But as he looked past her, toward the double doors where the red "surgery" sign glowed like a fresh wound, he realized that power was useless here. For the first time in a decade, Yimin Kwon was truly powerless. He turned away without another word, the too calm mask settling back over his face, hiding the roar of a man who was realizing that his secrets had built a wall between him and the only person who made his life worth living. He sat on a hard, blue plastic chair, a king in a kingdom of grief, waiting for a name he wasn't allowed to claim. The leather of the sedan's rear seat felt like a cold shroud as Yimin leaned his head back, his eyes closed, but his mind a frantic hive of logistics. He had left the hospital not because he was defeated by a nurse's bureaucracy, but because he realized that sitting in a plastic chair was a luxury he could no longer afford. To save Zariah, he had to become the man he had promised her he would never be again. "Back to the high-rise," he commanded. The car tore through the Baltimore mist, a black streak of vengeance aimed at the heart of the city. The high-rise was a penthouse that smelled of ozone, expensive cedar, and the humming heat of high-end servers. This was his command center, a place where the city didn't look like a collection of neighborhoods, but a grid of data points and vulnerabilities. As he stepped inside, his jacket was taken by a silent subordinate, and he moved directly to the wall of monitors that dominated the living space. "Every camera within a 10-block radius of the diner," Yeeman said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Gas stations, ATMs, traffic lights. I want the angles the police missed. I want the shadows." For the next 15 hours, Yeeman Kwon became a ghost in his own home. He didn't eat. He didn't sleep. He watched the world in grainy black and white and jittery technicolor. He watched the city breathe, saw the shift changes at the docks, the drug deals in the alleys, the late-night lovers haunting the piers. He scrolled through hours of footage, his eyes burning under the harsh blue light of the screens, looking for the one ripple in the water that didn't belong. He saw her dozens of times. He watched Zariah lock the diner door at 10:15 p.m. He watched her adjust her bag, her braids swaying with the rhythm of a woman who was tired but unbroken. Every time her image appeared on a screen, his heart stuttered, a painful reminder of the blood he had touched on the cobblestones. Then at 3:42 a.m., he found it. A flickering camera from a liquor store 2 blocks away caught a silver sedan idling with its lights off. A man stepped out to light a cigarette, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. Yeeman leaned in, his breath hitching. He enhanced the frame, the pixels knitting together to form a face. The man was young, maybe mid-20s, with a hollowed-out look that spoke of a desperate addiction. But it was his hands that gave him away. They were trembling so violently he could barely hold the lighter. When he looked toward the camera, Yeeman saw his eyes. They were bad eyes, wide, unfocused, and filmed over with a frantic, twitchy energy. This wasn't a professional hitman. This was a nervous amateur looking for a target he wasn't stable enough to hit. Yeeman watched as the man raised a heavy, black handgun, aiming it at a figure just off-screen. A different waitress, one with a similar build to Zariah, who was walking 20 yards ahead of her. The shooter fired, the recoil nearly knocking him over. The bullet went wide, striking Zariah as she turned the corner, a victim of a shaking hand and a redirected grudge. Yeeman stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. He didn't need to see anymore. The 15-hour ghost had found what he was looking for. He reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over a contact he hadn't called in years. The strategy was over. The accounting had begun. The smell of antiseptic was no longer a clinical abstraction. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that Zariah Cole fought to push off as her eyes flickered open. The world was a blur of harsh white and the rhythmic, mocking chirp of a heart monitor. Her left shoulder felt like it had been branded with a hot iron, a deep, throbbing ache that pulsed in time with the fluorescent lights overhead. Then she saw him. Yeeman was sitting in the shadows of the corner, his tailored suit jacket draped over the back of a plastic chair. He looked immaculate, as always, but there was a jaggedness to the way he held his shoulders, a hairline fracture in his usual mask of stone. When he saw her move, he was at her side in a heartbeat, his cool, dry hand catching hers. "Don't move," he murmured, his voice thick with a raw, unfiltered relief. "The doctors, they said you were lucky. 4 inches, Zariah. 4 inches and I would be kneeling at a different kind of stone tonight." Zariah tried to swallow, her throat feeling like it was lined with glass. She looked at the IV line in her arm and the sterile bandages wrapping her chest, then back at the man she loved, the man whose world was filled with shadows she had tried so hard to ignore. "I told you," Yeeman whispered, his grip on her hand tightening. "I told you that diner wasn't safe. I told you I could take care of everything. You wouldn't have been on that street if you had just listened to me. You don't have to work like this, Zariah. You never had to." Zariah closed her eyes for a moment, a tired smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Even now, with a bullet hole in her shoulder, her spirit remained as stubborn as the city that had raised her. She opened her eyes, their large, expressive depths clouding with a fierce, quiet pride. "I've been working since I was 9 years old, Yi-min," she rasped, her voice a fragile thread. "Carrying groceries for neighbors, scrubbing floors, walking miles just to save a bus fare. It's not just a job, it's how I know I'm still standing." "You're barely standing now," he countered, his jaw tightening. "But I'm standing on my own," she breathed. "If I let you take care of me, if I become just another piece of your beautiful, dangerous life, then who am I? I'm adaptable, Yi-min. I've survived hunger and I've survived grief. I can survive a mistake in a dark alley, but I won't survive losing myself to your shadow." Yi-min looked away, the silence between them stretching thin and painful. He wanted to scream that his shadow was the only thing that could keep her breathing, but he saw the set of her jaw, the same jawline that had charmed him in an Atlanta rainstorm. She wasn't just a nurse or a waitress. She was a woman who defined herself by her labor and her independence. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever known," he said softly, bringing her knuckles to his lips. "And you're the most dangerous man," she whispered back. "Go find out who did this, not for your pride, but because they almost took away my daughter's mother." Yi-min nodded, the coldness returning to his gaze. He kissed her forehead, a silent promise, and stood up. The fiancé was leaving, the boss was taking his place. He had 15 hours of footage burned into his retinas and a name that was about to become a death sentence. The command center was silent, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the cooling fans and the occasional static crackle from the police scanners Yi-min kept tuned to the city's heartbeat. He stood before the wall of monitors, his shadow cast long and distorted across the hardwood floor. In the blue-white glare of the screens, his face looked carved from marble, featureless, frozen, and terrifyingly still. He replayed the footage from the liquor store camera for the 100th time. His eyes, sharp and predatory, didn't watch Zaraya this time. Instead, he watched the silver sedan and the man with the bad eyes. He tracked the shooter's line of sight, mapping the trajectory of a shaking hand against the geometry of the street. On the screen, a woman walked 20 yards ahead of Zaraya. She was wearing a similar uniform, the same white shirt and black apron, but her gait was different, hurried and frantic. This was the woman the shooter had been waiting for. When the muzzle flashed, the shooter hadn't even been looking at Zaraya. He had been aiming at the first flash of white linen he saw in the dark. The realization didn't bring Yi-min peace. It brought a cold, subterranean rage that settled into his bones like frost. To the Underworld, a targeted hit was business. It had logic, a beginning and an end. But a mistake. A mistake meant his world had bled into hers by sheer, careless accident. Zaraya was lying in a hospital bed with a tube in her chest not because of a grand betrayal or a strategic strike, but because a coward couldn't aim. "It wasn't for her," Yi-min whispered, the words barely a breath. He leaned into the console, his fingers flying across the keys as he cross-referenced the silver sedan's plates with his internal database of local bottom feeders. The shooter wasn't a professional. He was a debt collector for a small-time extortion crew that operated out of the West Side docks, a group so insignificant Yi-min usually didn't even acknowledge their existence. They had been trying to silence a different waitress, a girl named Maya who had witnessed a back-alley deal, and they had sent a man too high on his own supply to tell one black woman from another. The insult of it was almost as sharp as the injury. Yi-min felt his pulse slowing, a strange, clinical detachment taking hold. This was the too calm state his enemies feared most. When Yi-min was loud, he was merely angry. When he was quiet like this, he was preparing to erase someone from the ledger of the living. He picked up his phone and dialed a number that connected to a secure line in the harbor district. "Doyen," he said when the line picked up. "I have a tag and a face. I don't want to hit. Not yet. I want the air around this man to disappear. I want his bank accounts drained, his associates terrified, and his front door kicked in by morning. I want him to feel the shadow before he sees the man." He hung up and looked back at the screen, at the grainy image of Zaraya falling to the cobblestones. The mistake was a debt that could only be paid in a very specific currency. He didn't just want the shooter. He wanted the entire world that had allowed such a careless hand to hold a gun near his heart. Yi-min reached for his coat, the silk lining sliding over his arms like a second skin. The hunt was no longer about discovery. It was about the slow, agonizing process of accounting. The silver sedan didn't look like a getaway car anymore. It looked like a tombstone. It was parked haphazardly in a gravel lot behind a row of dilapidated warehouses, the engine still ticking as it cooled in the midnight air. Inside a cramped, dimly lit basement unit nearby, the man with the bad eyes sat on a stained mattress, his hands still trembling as he tried to load a fresh magazine into his handgun. He was jumpy, the kind of nervous that makes a man see ghosts in every shadow, but he never heard the door open. He didn't hear it because Yi Min's men didn't kick doors. They dissolved them. Before the shooter could even stand, a heavy, gloved hand slammed his head into the cinderblock wall. The gun clattered to the floor, kicked away into the darkness by a silent figure in a black suit. The shooter gasped, his vision swimming, as he was hauled up and dropped into a wooden chair in the center of the room. A single industrial bulb flickered overhead, casting long, jagged shadows against the damp walls. Yi Min stepped out of the darkness. He looked as though he had just stepped off a runway, his white shirt crisp and his sharp jawline clean cut, but the stillness in his eyes was absolute. He didn't look angry. He looked like a surgeon preparing for a difficult but necessary amputation. "You were looking for Maya," Yi Min said, his voice a low, melodic silk that made the shooter's skin crawl. "A girl who saw something she shouldn't have, a girl you were paid to silence." The shooter tried to speak, his teeth chattering, but only a pathetic whimper escaped. I didn't. It was dark." "It was dark," Yi Min repeated, nodding slowly as he pulled a pair of thin, leather gloves tight over his knuckles. "And because it was dark, and because your hands are weak, you put a bullet into Zariah Cole. Do you know who she is?" "And no," the man sobbed. "She is the woman who carries the weight of this city on her shoulders. She is a mother. She is a light." Yi Min stepped closer, his shadow swallowing the smaller man. "And she is mine. Every drop of blood she left on that cobblestone is a debt you cannot afford to pay." Yi Min signaled to Doyen, who stepped forward and pinned the shooter's right hand to the wooden table. The man began to scream, a high-pitched, primal sound that was swallowed by the thick concrete walls. Yi Min reached into his pocket and produced a small, silver tool, not a weapon, but a precision instrument used for heavy-duty wire cutting. "You use these fingers to pull a trigger," Yi Min whispered, leaning in so close the shooter could see the calm, terrifying lack of mercy in his pupils. "You use them to create chaos because you are too high to see the target. I am going to make sure that was your last shooting, not because I am a monster, but because I am an accountant, and the math of your life no longer adds up." He didn't look away as he worked. He was methodical, delivering a correction that was as much a symbolic statement as it was a physical one. When he was finished, the shooter's hand was a ruined, useless thing, a permanent reminder that some people are too dangerous to miss. Yi Min stood up, wiping a small speck of dust from his sleeve. "Put him on a boat, somewhere far enough that he forgets the name of this city. If he ever touches a piece of cold steel again, kill him." He walked out into the night, the too calm mask never slipping. The debt had been settled, but the inventory was still incomplete. He had one more stop to make, the only one that mattered. The morning light that filtered through the windows of St. Jude was thin and gray, offering no warmth to the sterile recovery room. Zariah sat on the edge of the bed, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were made of glass that had been expertly glued back together. She was pale-faced, the deep mahogany of her skin now ashen from the loss of blood and the grueling toll of the surgery. Her signature braids were pulled back loosely, and she wore an oversized sweater Yi Min had brought, the soft cashmere a stark contrast to the rough, white hospital gown she had finally discarded. When the door opened, Yi Min didn't enter so much as he reclaimed the space. He was back in a fresh suit, charcoal this time, his presence a silent, overwhelming force that seemed to push the hospital's lingering chaos back into the hallway. He didn't speak immediately. He simply stood there, his calm, intimidating eyes scanning her face for any new sign of pain. "The discharge papers are signed," he said, his voice a low, soothing anchor. "Everything is handled." He helped her stand, his touch incredibly light, as if he were afraid his own strength might bruise her. Zaraya leaned into him, her independence momentarily surrendered to the exhaustion that lived deep in her marrow. She didn't ask about the shooter. She didn't ask about the night he had spent away from her side. She saw the minute tension in his jaw and the way his hands stayed steady, too steady, and she knew that the man who had returned to her was the one who had finished an accounting. They moved through the lobby in a bubble of silence. The nurses who had ignored him the night before now looked away as they passed, sensing a shift in the atmosphere they couldn't quite name. Outside, the black sedan was waiting, the engine idling with a low, predatory purr. Doyen held the door open, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his posture as rigid as a soldier. As the car pulled away from the curb and into the mid-morning traffic, the tone of the journey changed. Yimin sat beside her, not touching her, but his shadow draped over her like a protective wing. He stared out the window at the passing city, the diners, the docks, the back alleys, and his gaze was ancient and unstoppable. He wasn't just a man taking his fiancée home. He was a king surveying a territory he had just reasserted his right to rule. Zaraya watched the rhythmic pulse of the city through the tinted glass, feeling the hum of the car beneath her. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was heavy with the weight of things left unsaid. Yimin's intent was clear in the way the driver cleared the lanes, moving with a terrifying, fluid precision. The world outside was the same, but the woman inside the car was different, and the man beside her had decided that the shadows were no longer a place to hide her, but a weapon to be wielded in her name. They drove toward the high-rise, leaving the working-class realism of the diner behind, moving toward a future where the secret was becoming a throne. The penthouse was a cathedral of glass and shadows, overlooking a city that looked like a circuit board of flickering lights. Inside, the air was still, cooled to a precise temperature that felt at odds with the humid, heavy memory of the hospital. Yimin helped Zaraya onto the sofa, a sprawling piece of dark velvet that seemed to swallow her small, exhausted frame. He didn't turn on the overhead lights. Instead, the room was bathed in the amber glow of the fireplace and the blue wash of the Baltimore skyline. He moved to the sideboard, pouring a glass of water with hands that were finally starting to show the faintest hint of a tremor. He brought it to her, watching as she took a slow, painful sip. The silence between them wasn't the comfortable quiet of their usual meetings. It was a pressurized space, filled with the unspoken reality of the blood he had scrubbed from his own mind and the bandages she wore beneath her sweater. "You almost died because I was arrogant," Yimin said suddenly. His voice was low, stripped of its usual melodic control. He didn't sit. He stood by the window, his back to her, his reflection ghost-like against the glass. "I spent years perfecting a ghost story. I thought if I kept you in the dark, the monsters in my world wouldn't be able to find you. I thought the secret was a shield." Zaraya looked at him, her large eyes reflecting the firelight. She leaned her head back against the cushion, her braids spilling over her shoulder. "You were trying to protect the girl you met in the rain, Yimin, not the woman who lives in this city." "I was protecting my own peace of mind," he countered, turning to face her. The too calm mask was gone, replaced by a raw, jagged honesty. "By keeping us a secret, I denied you the only thing I have to offer that actually matters, my name. If the world had known you were mine, if that shooter had known whose shadow he was stepping into, he wouldn't have dared to draw a weapon within 10 miles of that restaurant. My silence didn't keep you safe. It made you a ghost, and ghosts are easy to shoot." He walked over and knelt on the floor before her, the silk of his trousers rustling against the rug. He took her uninjured hand, his sharp jawline tight. "I wanted to keep you clean. I wanted to keep your world of coffee and tired smiles separate from my world of ledgers and heavy steel. But that compartmentalization was a flaw in the math. I treated our life like a strategy instead of a reality." Zaraya reached out with her thumb, tracing the line of his cheek. "Is that what this is now? Reality?" "It has to be," Yimin whispered. "The secret is over, Zaraya. I'm not going to let you walk through this city as a stranger anymore. From tonight, the world knows who you are, and they will know that the price of touching you is more than they can ever pay." The weight of his confession hung in the air, a final surrender of the walls he had built. Zaraya looked at him, seeing the king who had stepped out of the shadows to claim his queen, realizing that their quiet, hidden romance had been a luxury they could no longer afford. The price of their secrets had been paid in blood, and neither of them was willing to let the debt go into arrears again. The announcement of their union didn't happen with a press release or a gala. It happened with a presence that shifted the very gravity of the neighborhood. 2 weeks after the shooting, Zariah returned to the street where she had nearly lost her life. She still wore her signature braids, long and defiant, and her jaw remained as soft yet strong as the day Yimin first saw her. She moved with a slight stiffness in her shoulder, a physical ghost of the bullet, but her eyes were no longer tired. They were clear, reflecting a woman who had integrated her struggle into her power. She wasn't wearing a waitress uniform this time. She wore a deep emerald silk wrap that complemented the rich mahogany of her skin, a gift from Yimin that felt less like an apology and more like armor. Beside her, Yimin walked with a slow, deliberate pace, his hand resting firmly at the small of her back. He wasn't hiding in a tinted sedan or waiting in a shadow-drenched cafe. He was standing in the full, unforgiving light of a Baltimore afternoon, his sharp jawline set in a mask of too calm authority. As they walked past the diner, the air seemed to still. The men on the corners, the shopkeepers, and the low-level runners who kept the city's secrets all stopped. They didn't just see a beautiful couple, they saw a declaration of war and a promise of peace. They saw the man who controlled the city's pulse finally revealing the source of his own. Yimin stopped in front of the very spot where the blood had once stained the stones. He didn't look at the ground. He looked at the horizon, his intimidation coming from his absolute stillness. The new guard, a veteran associate, whispered from the periphery, nodding toward the pair. The message was sent without a single word being spoken. Zariah Cole was no longer a ghost. She was the anchor of the Kwon syndicate, the woman whose safety was now the highest law in the territory. Yimin had realized that true protection wasn't found in a secret, but in a reputation so absolute that no one would ever dare mistake her for anyone else again. Zariah looked at Yimin, her expressive eyes softening for him alone. She had kept her strength, her braids, and her fierce independence, but she had allowed him to close the 4-inch gap that had almost ended them. As they stepped into the waiting car, the city watched them go, a king and his queen, no longer divided by shadows, but united by a flame that had been forged in the dark. The secret was dead, and in its place, a new, unbreakable reality had begun.